Hello,
Hi there, how are you?
I'm good. Let's see. Okay. Do I have
There you are.
everything?
Yeah.
Let me just close the door here.
How are you?
I'm doing well. How about you?
Good.
Good. I think I'm ready. I hope I'm ready.
That's how I feel too. I'm more ready as I'm ever going to be, put it that way, right? So on my screen, there's a more button at the bottom, and I can just click live on Facebook. Do you have an option like that or no?
Nope. Chat meeting settings, minimize meeting, background and filters, disconnect audio.
Well, it must just be mine. Then we'll wait a couple more minutes. But last night when I tried it, it was just one or two buttons and you're in. I mean, it's like
Yeah, I think it because I kept looking and that's what it kept saying. And I'm like, I don't have that. And then it said had to have, well, they kept saying if you have a licensed version, which I mean, I assume it's licensed, I don't know. But then I started reading, it said like pro, executive. Yeah. And so I was like, oh, I just have the free account. So
it's a new feature because it didn't last time I used it, it didn't have that.
okay.
So
Do you just have like the $14.99 a month or something like that?
yeah,
Okay.
it's just kind of the inexpensive one.
It
Someday
would sure help with lives, I think.
yeah, well, it is nice to have a backup recording of things because somewhere things always get lost, and to have it out in the cloud is just really useful.
Yeah. Now, are you going to post the recording after this?
Yes, I can send
Okay.
you a link when it's ready and you can post it also
Oh, okay, great.
if you want to. So yes, we will definitely do that.
All right. Well,
So
I've just got some stuff here. I'm going to have to just angle my camera down, but I have it all set so that I can angle it down and show what I'm doing and then
okay, awesome.
angle it back up. So
That's great. I have a few little supplies we can talk about, wax,
okay.
stuff like that.
Ah, yeah.
Exciting things like wax.
I have wax.
So
It does make a big difference, but I always forget to use it.
I didn't use it for years and years and years, and I just recently found this at the farmer's market, and I picked it up, and I'm so glad I have it now. I've been using it a lot, even just to thread my sewing machine, just to run the end of the thread over the wax a few times before I try and put it through the needle.
Yeah.
It's been really helpful. And I know
that's a good idea. I have a threader, but in my course, I show them obviously how to thread it and that it has to thread from front to back, because not everybody does, especially on less expensive machines.
Right. Works most of the time, but sometimes it just doesn't, for some reason, it just doesn't pull the thread through.
What brand is your machine?
It's a Husqvarna Diamond Royale. I've only had it for about a year. And the one I had before that was a really old Husqvarna, but it worked great. So this newer one is a little bit more finicky. It's kind of temperamental,
Isn't that frustrating that the newer machines just aren't the same quality?
Yeah, it's very frustrating.
And when people ask me, what kind of machine should I get to start? I'm like, you know what? If you don't think you want all the bells and whistles, which you may not need to start, go with an older machine. Look at Facebook Marketplace and you're going to get much better deals.
Yeah, those old machines, even if you pay a couple $100 for a old machine that's in premium working condition, you're saving yourself a bundle because the
yes, you are.
Yeah, they have the bells and whistles, but you know what? They break down. They're hard to maintain. A lot of times you don't have a rep in your area. There's so many reasons to, go with a simple mechanical machine that you can fix yourself. And
yep,
I'm kind of in the market for one. I haven't jumped yet, but I'm sort of watching. I had, before we moved a year ago, I had like 4 vintage machines, and I'm just,
Oh,
I sold them all when we moved because it just didn't make sense to haul on.
yeah. Oh,
So anyway, all right, well, I have 2 o'clock, so
okay.
let's see if we can get this show going here.
I'm reaching over here. I'm not leaving. I love your cover with all the different photos. Did you do that in Canva?
Thank you. I had a VA do it for me. Yes.
Ah, okay. That's cool. Okay.
So I'm waiting for some big sign that we're live here on
Yeah,
Facebook.
I pulled it up to your page. I don't see it yet.
It's thinking. Here we go.
Photos. Did you do that in Canva?
Thank you.
Oh, there we go.
Okay.
Cool.
Awesome. All righty. So we are ready. Well, let's start with introductions, I guess. Would be the best. I'm waiting for some big sign that we're live. Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I pulled it up to your page. I don't see it yet.
Oh, are you still there?
Yeah.
Okay, I just closed out of it thinking that it was interfering, but now.
I think you can you mute it, or do you have both on the same machine?
They're both on the same machine, so. Well, let me just check on my phone and see if I can see us from there.
I don't see it on my laptop yet. It's your Chambray Blues account, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I certainly hope it wouldn't go on my personal page, but you know, Facebook has a mind of its own.
It does.
It is. Okay, I guess we're on my personal page, so that's not where I want it to be, but we'll see if we can share it to where it's supposed to go.
A couple of weeks ago, Facebook came up and they said, do you want to also stream this to your group? And I was like, yeah, that'd be great. So I did, and it worked perfectly. The next week, I tried to do the same thing and somehow ended up not streaming to my page, not streaming to my group, streaming to my completely hidden group that's for my course.
Oh, no. It's a learning curve, that's for sure. Okay, well, we are live. I can tell we are, so we'll just start it. So for anyone who's here watching us on Facebook or from Instagram or wherever, I'm Jessica Cramer. My business is Chambray Blue Sewing. I design sewing patterns and teach tutorials. And today I have a special guest with me. This is Jenni Miller from Let's Get Sewing. And Jenni is got a lot of expertise that I don't have, so it's really great to be able to share ideas with other people. You know, we kind of feed off of each other's creativity and knowledge. And we're going to talk about some techniques for hand sewing. And I have to admit that I don't do a lot of hand sewing. It's not really my thing. I do a lot of sewing of hems on the machine and so forth, but every once in a while I break down and, you know, break my own rules and do a little bit. So Jenni, tell us a little bit more about your experience and what you like to do with your hand sewing techniques.
My experience. I've been sewing for years, since I was a kid, but I went off to college and tried a couple different majors, and my mom said, why don't you take a sewing class? So I did, and then I was hooked. So that's what I got my degree in. And I took the design classes, the pattern drafting classes, the draping classes, but I just loved the construction, how to manipulate the fabric, make it do what you want, that kind of thing. And sometimes the easiest way to manipulate it is with hand sewing. That having been said, I have a hemmer back here because when it comes to a blind hem, sometimes I like to just zip it right through there. But I've done, cross stitch, and recently picked up knitting and other things. So a lot of my hand sewing is like embroidery, needlework, that type of thing. So
specifically with apparel, there's some areas where you might need to know hand sewing in order to get a really nicely finished garment. So one of those would be, like, for example, a hem. Like she mentioned, the blind hemmer is what you would do on a sewing machine. But if you're working with a finer fabric, you don't want to do that. You want to use hand stitches to make that hem more invisible.
If I'm doing, anything like that, last year I did my daughter-in-law's wedding dress. It had not a huge train, but a little bit of a train and very rounded. That doesn't work well on the hemmer or as a rolled hem, really. That required hand stitching around that. Anything satiny, finer, for sure needs to be hemmed with that. Also, I'm one of the weird sewists who does not mind doing alterations and mending, and I've done a lot of men's suit coats, and a lot of times either you split the seam down the back of the suit coat or you open it up at the bottom between the lining and the coat, and then that is best, usually easiest put back together by hand as well.
Yeah, men's suits are a great thing to look at for hand sewing. If you take that apart at all, if you've ever seen the inside of a well-tailored suit, well, in women's too, actually, but the whole front of the suit is all done by hand. It's beautiful. Rows of pad stitching that keep the wool in the right shape for the collar and all of
and
that
over the chest and everything. Yeah, that was one of my favorite classes in college, was tailoring, and we did it both using just the interfacing to manipulate the fabric, and then we also did the pad stitching, and I loved it.
It's just, you can't duplicate that any other way. I mean, the only way to get that look is by hand sewing. And if you look at designer garments, like wool coats, for example, they have hand stitching around the edge of the collar a lot of times. Plus, what you don't see inside, but usually around the pocket, like the flap of the pocket might be hand stitched, or even the welt on the pocket might have some hand stitching around it. Of course, buttons on finer coats are probably hand stitched because they have like leather shanks and things, a lot of different techniques that we don't really do a whole lot in regular everyday kind of apparel that we
right.
So let's talk a little bit about supplies that you need for sewing things by hand. What kind of supplies do you use?
Well, for me, the most important is the needle. And I don't know how well you can see this here if I put my hand back here. These are tiny little needles, and I like to work with a tiny, just the tinier the better for finer work. I do have larger ones when I'm whipping something really quick. I just keep by my machine, that's a much bigger.
That's kind of the standard size. That's what I use.
Needle, yeah.
Longer one, yeah.
But if I'm wanting tiny, fine stitches, I like to keep teeny tiny needles around. And you have to look really carefully. You may not find these with the other sewing notions. They might be back in the, where you'd find the cross stitch, crewel embroidery, stuff like that. So yeah, the tinier needle, the better. But a tiny needle means a tiny eye. And so I can't live without these needle threaders. If I don't have one close by, I'll just take a piece of my regular sewing thread, machine thread, make a loop and try to stick it through the eye. The same principle, put the loop through, put your yarn or whatever through, your floss through, and then pull it back through. But yeah, can't live without a needle threader because the eyes are so tiny that you just can't get the thread through very easily. So those are my the top two things. I always like to have any kind, and I have a couple, any kind of spring-loaded nippers, because I can snip it off right at the surface really easily, grab them, they're just easier to manipulate than a big pair of sewing scissors. So nippers are probably my other have to have. And then lastly, I don't use this as much in apparel. Well, I do if I'm tailoring. They're called tailor point scissors. But you know, I use them for just a lot of fine work in the buttonholes. And well, I'll show you in a minute some of the stuff I've been doing with the buttonhole stitch, but it's a kind of a cutout lace. And so I use it anything like that where you need to get down into the little details. This is good for clipping seams, even when you're not hand sewing, just, you know, notching or clipping your seams. That's what I like to use those for. So those are probably my have to haves. Those are the things I keep in my bag. And when it comes to hand sewing, I mean, my kids are grown now, but I started the habit of keeping hand projects just in a tote bag that I could take to, you know, swimming lessons, gymnastics lessons, pull it out and work while they were in class. And so I still do that. I'll keep one down in my family room. I usually have a project going that I can work on in front of the TV.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Always have something to keep your hands busy. It's amazing how much you can accomplish that way. I have a couple other things to add to your list. So we were talking, Jenny, and we're talking a little bit about wax a few minutes ago. So in couture sewing, they use a lot of hand techniques, and it is recommended by the well-known couturiers to use wax with their thread before they hand stitch something. And the way it works is they just, you know, take the thread. When it comes off the spool, sometimes if it's a small spool like this one, it can get really curly, and you probably cannot see that at all. But anyhow, this straightens it out. You just run it across the wax like so, and it makes it so much easier to work with because you have a nice straight thread then. And I was telling Jenny, I recently picked up this wax at the farmer's market, and I've been using it on the end of my thread before I try and thread the needle on my sewing machine. And that's been really helpful because it'll just
I've got to start trying that for sure.
Yeah. And then thimble is another good thing to have around. I don't know if you use one. I have a couple different ones. I'm not a huge thimble person because I don't do a ton of hand sewing, but it is so hard to find one that's exactly the right size.
I have never effectively used a thimble. My mom tried to teach me, and this is probably really bad. I use my fingernails to kind of get behind the needle and push it. The thimble seems to get in my way too much. I don't know.
Yeah, it's definitely something that you have to practice with. I think women who do a lot of quilting by hand, you really use thimbles. They get really good at it. This one I actually got from a quilting show, and it's leather, and they like form it to your finger. So it actually stays on really well, and it feels really comfortable, and I kind of don't even know that it's there. So that's probably my favorite one. This one was a Cricut one. This is another leather one, which I find useful for maybe doing buttons or coats or something a little bit heavier, because this is really heavy duty. I know I won't puncture through that at all. And then I have a couple of what I call needle keepers. So these little old-fashioned strawberries that you would see attached to a pin cushion are for keeping your needles in there, and they have sand inside to keep your needles sharp and clean, and you just run your needle through there a few times, and that helps to keep it in good order. Plus, if you put all your needles in the strawberry, you won't lose them, because I lose absolutely everything. And that's my only way I can stay organized with these little bright red strawberries.
I do have that. I have the strawberries as well. I have, oh goodness, this is kind of crazy looking, but this little thing that sits by my machine with pins, you know, that I keep close by, and I keep needles in it. The issue with this is the needles push all the way in and then they're lost. I probably have a couple lost inside there. So the strawberry really does help.
Yeah, that's true. The needle without the head, like the pin, you know, if you stick it in something, it's history. It's gone. And I continually buy more packages of needles and lose them all.
Yep.
I find my needles in a circle thing like this, and it's sort of a good way to keep them. It's a different dial. You can dial up the one you want, and then you just tilt the circle so that the hole is where you need it and the needle comes out. And I just started doing that, and I actually like these because again, it's easy for me to find the right size with this. Now, do hand sewing needles come in different sizes the way that machine sewing needles do? I don't know.
I gotta be honest, I just go visually. I was looking on these packages to see if I could give you an example of a gauge, and I really couldn't tell you. I was just going to show you that when you showed that circle thing, my mom died recently and I inherited a bunch of her stuff. I don't know if you can see this, but this pack of needles was 15 cents. This is truly vintage.
Love that.
But embroidery and crewel is what I like because they are specifically made for the tiny. These are a little bit bigger than the ones I just showed you, but not quite as big as, you know, some of the bigger ones in that circle.
Yeah, these are long, and you know, I guess I like the longer needles just for me personally. I have kind of big hands, and I'm not real adept at working with the tiny things, so it's just easier for me to manage a little bit bigger. So, okay, so let's talk a little bit about what kind of stitches and things you would use with hand sewing, and a little bit about how they work. We talked before about hemming. So when I have done hemming by hand, I usually use a catch stitch, which is fairly simple one. It's something I use with a lace, a hem lace on the edge of the fabric.
Okay, yeah.
And the reason I do that is because it makes a nice transition between the thickness of the fabric and the hem. Basically, you want the hem to disappear, and with the catch stitch, it doesn't show at all on the right side of the garment. And you're just basically working behind the hem lace. You kind of fold it down and do your stitching behind there.
It also just looks pretty.
It does. It looks pretty and feminine, and that is one of my favorite ways to do a hem on a nice garment.
And you can do the same thing in a men's pant with a twill tape. You know, the same thing, especially, and in any garment, in alterations, this is more of an issue than in when you're doing custom sewing. But, you know, if you get down to just a teeny bit of fabric, the extra twill tape or lace gives you just more to work with under there.
Yeah, to extend the length so that you have enough to actually turn up for the hem. That's true. If you're making something longer, a lot of times you don't have much left. I think especially in ready to wear garments now, it seems like hems are skimpier than they used to be. You know, you don't have as many options. So that's one of the things that I use hand sewing for. And the other one that I probably use the most often is slip stitch. And that would be for like the inside of a collar, if you're putting together two pieces of fabric that you want to encase a seam allowance inside, maybe a belt where you have two pieces of fabric coming together, and you do the sewing on either end, and you have to leave an opening to turn the belt right side out. Then you would slip stitch the opening closed. And that's, again, a very simple kind of a stitch. I don't know, I prefer to do mine maybe half an inch in length. I don't make them super small. You probably do, Jenny. And I just, you know, go from a thread on one piece of the fabric and grab a thread on the other side of the fabric. And it's not as pretty as it probably should be. I'm using a dark colored thread here so you can kind of see it, but it ends up right along the edge of the fabric. And that is probably the extent of my hand sewing experience. So what do you use a slip stitch for, Jenny?
I have used it to join the lining to the garment, like in a skirt, a lined skirt. If you have like the satiny type lining, you know, you hem that up, you hem the skirt up, but how can I do this? Here's my skirt, here's the hem, and then the hem of your lining is just slightly up there covering it. And I've used that, and I go back and forth between the skirt hem itself and the fabric to join them, but it's not so tight that every time you move, your lining's going to pull the skirt. It lets the two move a little bit separately.
Right. That's the
If
beauty
that
of
makes
it.
sense. I can see it in my brain. I hope I'm explaining it.
No, yeah, that's fine. The handwork is great for easing the fabrics together. You can't do
Yes.
that with the sewing machine all the time. To some fabrics are easier than others, like wool is easier to ease
Yeah.
than other fabrics. But for the most part, the hand sewing makes that work so much better. It
Yes.
does give you more room for movement. The catch stitch too has a little bit of a give to it. As you're wearing the skirt or the slacks, it tends to rip less because it has a little bit of give to it, where a rigid like top stitch would not.
Right.
So, okay, then what about like sewing buttonholes? I have never hand sewn a buttonhole. I have repaired a couple of buttonholes by hand just out of necessity. And it's basically, I don't know, just curling the threads around what used to be there because I cut it or something like that. Is nothing especially interesting. But Jenny, tell us more about how you do that type of sewing.
So I use a buttonhole stitch, which is the same as a blanket stitch. And a lot of people might know blanket stitch and not realize that it's the same. I wish I had a blanket with the example. Well, but I'll show you here. So here is, I haven't cut the buttonhole yet, but I've gone around this buttonhole. And when I do it, I do one buttonhole at a time with a little 4-inch or 3-inch, whatever this particular hoop is. But if you were doing like a blanket stitch, I'm wondering how I could show you really quickly. I should have loaded I'll do this one. I've got a thread here, which needs to be waxed. But I'll just show you really quickly. And I'll tilt the camera down here so you can kind of see what I'm doing. So the blanket stitch is really actually kind of popular in a lot of like more country design or casual, but you could see it around the hem of garments, even jackets sometimes, just for decoration. But to do it, and you're going to be totally upside down from me. Let me try this. You come up through your fabric, you make a U shape up here.
Can you move it a little closer to you?
Oh, sorry.
There we go.
There we go. All right, so I have my U out this way. And then when I come up here at the edge of the fabric, I catch it with that U. And so you get this effect along the edge of the garment. And again, I come up through my U shape here and get that effect. And so all along the edge of the fabric here, I would have these stitches, just kind of like little lines. And I'm guessing, especially people were putting them on the edges of the fleece blankets as just a little finish, that type of thing. Well, when you move that super close together, it becomes this buttonhole stitch. And so this is kind of what your buttonhole would look like. This one, don't look at the stitching because I kind of messed it up, but I did cut it open. And I did it in a contrasting thread so that you could see it. I wouldn't probably do that on a real garment. This is just a scrap of fabric that I was playing with it on. But
those
that's
are beautiful. I would have never guessed that buttonhole was not machine made.
oh,
It's machine made. It's gorgeous.
Yeah, it's a fun effect. I was going to show you this. I don't know, maybe this is showing off, sorry, but it's another, here, I'll tilt it back up. This is another thing I inherited from my mom. I think this is older than I am, but I was bound and determined to finish them for my brothers. So I've been working on them. They're just little placemats or doilies. Like I think they'll each get one, so maybe they can put it on a dresser top or something. But this is almost all buttonhole stitch. There's some back stitch and French knots in there too. Wow. But when you get that buttonhole stitch, that it's the blanket stitch so close together, then you can actually cut out this fabric in here and it's not going to fray. And that's the same principle of those buttonholes. But the reason I'm showing you this one is because it looks better. When you're just going through one layer, you can make a stitch. When you're going through several layers like this on a placket, you kind of have to do it in steps. So you make that U shape up here. You can't just take one little stitch because you won't catch all of your layers. So if you do it in steps, you just come down where you want it and back up. If I can see it, there we go, where you want it. And you've done the same thing. You've caught your thread just like you did on the edge of the blanket stitch. So you just keep doing that over and over right next to each other. You might be able to see the little line where I marked where my buttonhole would go.
It's beautiful.
And you just do it all the way around, and it's just a fun effect. And I think if the fabric and the thread matched even better, it would look a little bit nicer. But it just gives it, like you said, the couture effect. You know, something that would just be a jacket would be, ooh, a jacket kind of thing.
Yeah. Now let's talk about thread. I noticed, were you using floss for those?
Oh, for these I was using floss, yes. You can probably see it better here. Just, this is how you normally would see DMC floss. I don't know where I put it. Let's see. Because I inherited this from my mom, it came on a spool like this, but it still says DMC. And then if you take your floss, you know, pull out the length that you need. Oh, here's the piece I wanted. There we go.
How much is a good length for doing that type of detail work?
For this kind, I pull out probably 2 feet.
Okay.
And so I have to start over, you know, each time that I do it. But if you have more than that, you're going to start tangling on yourself.
Yeah.
But I don't know if you know, DMC floss comes in a 6-ply. And so for these, I pulled out just 2 of those 6 threads, like that, if you can see it.
Yep.
And then if you take and make a Y and put your finger through the middle, and that's how you would split it so that it doesn't make a tangled knot on you.
I did not know that. I can't tell you how many tangled knots I have had and used floss like that.
Yeah, you just make that Y and stick your finger in the middle. And so you're kind of holding it, you know, at the top of the Y. And for me, it's my left hand because I'm right-handed. And with my right hand, I have my finger here, and these fingers are just keeping it. That's it.
You make that look so easy. It's so much easier than the way I do it. I just like pull one at a time, and then it's all snarled up. And then I gotta, it's awful.
Now you could do the same technique with sewing thread, but you're not going to get that thick. It's going to be harder to fill in the gaps for one thing. You're just not going to get that shiny, solid seam to it. You know, for the buttonhole, you want it to be solid to hold all the threads in place. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And if you were working with machine thread, I just don't think it would lie as nicely.
Yeah, I can see that. I tend to sew with 100% cotton thread. It's harder to find in the stores than it used to be. You know, a lot of times it's just labeled as quilting thread or quilting cotton.
Right.
And I use that for my hand sewing, which is thicker, but you're right, it doesn't have that smooth texture to it.
Right.
For fabrics, it just doesn't work as well. Like for silk, I mean, it's okay, but I can see floss being much better for finer fabrics.
Yeah, it's definitely not as tightly wound.
Yeah, and the colors, I don't know, the colors in the floss are always so pretty. Plus you can get like variegated colors too, can't you?
Yeah, which can make a really pretty effect.
Yeah, that would be really beautiful for some things. You know, you can't always find a thread that's exactly the right match. Let's talk about washability. So when you wash a garment that has a lot of hand sewing or like a buttonholes that are hand sewn, is there anything special that you need to do?
You need to, pay attention to what's in them. Now, DMC floss, I believe is, and I don't have my glasses on here, I think is 100% cotton. And so you need to be aware of that. I would maybe, if you need to, you'll be washing the garment a lot. You can put your spool of floss in some warm water to pre-shrink it somewhat. But I would probably hand wash the garment and not machine wash it, because you wouldn't want your buttonholes to suddenly shrink up on you.
And get misshapen, and after all that hard work, you don't want to mess it up. I wash everything that I make on like a hand wash cycle, washer, and then I either line dry it or tumble on low just for a short time until it's ready to line dry. So I think that's great information. What about stitches for mending? Like you said, you mentioned earlier that you do a lot of mending by hand. Are there any particular stitches you use for that?
Mostly, most of it would be in the seam, and I like the ladder stitch for that. I don't know if you've seen the ladder stitch. If you have both of your seams coming down, you catch this side, then this side, then this side, and go back and forth like that. When it comes to mending tears and things like that, I either use a darning stitch on my machine, or will just, if I can find a really closely matched thread, just kind of go through and catch the two sides of a tear. But yeah, for most of that kind of mending, I use the darning stitch on my machine.
I don't do a ton of mending either. And when I do, it's usually just something little by hand, like a little hole, or like the hole I put in my shirt today when I was, I put my story on Instagram when I was finishing up this blouse this morning. I was almost done with it. And I was just cutting the threads, and I was in this big hurry, snip, snip, snip. And then I cut a hole in it. I'm like, oh my gosh. So I had to sew the whole shot. It's right back there. No one's really going to see it other than when you announce it on Instagram and Facebook. But it's just kind of funny. That's one of the few things that I also use hand sewing for. It's just little tiny holes. They happen.
Yep. A back stitch is another one. If you're sewing up a seam that's going to take a lot of stretching or stress, I like the back stitch. I feel like it's a little bit stronger, if I'm repairing it by hand. A lot of those too you can do on your machine, but if I'm doing them by hand, I'll use the back stitch.
Okay, I think that's similar to the stitch that they use for installing zippers.
I think so, yes.
Drawing a blank, what it is now, it's right in my mind and I can't think of it. Pig stitch. Pig stitch is the same as a back stitch, right?
Yes, yeah.
So when you're installing an invisible zipper, I was thinking we should maybe do a whole segment on zippers sometime.
Oh yeah, there's a ton you can do on zippers.
Different ways to do it, but if you install an invisible zipper from the wrong side by hand with little tiny hand stitches, it's virtually invisible on the right side of the garment. It works great for dressy, bridal gowns or evening wear. Anything where you don't want the zipper to show in the back works really well for that.
Right.
And it's quite durable. I have never had one come apart. I use that in pretty much any dress that I sew. I use that style for the zipper, and they're great. It doesn't seem to come out. So
right.
Okay. Anything else you can think of that I'm missing here?
I just thought of one thing, and I hope I can explain this right. When I have mended a seam or a hole or anything like that, I make sure after I've tied it off to take my thread to the back side and leave a thread, which I hate to have threads on the inside of garments, but if you leave an inch to an inch and a half, you're less likely to have that knot come undone on you and, have the seam come out. So when I'm hand stitching, I do like to leave some thread on the inside just to keep my knot more secure.
That's a good idea. I have seen, in some cases, I'll put fray check on the end of threads like that, because if I'm not sure if they're gonna hold up or if it's in a delicate spot, it just seems to kind of reinforce it a little bit.
Right.
And that's another option. You could do that. But I like the idea of just leaving a little extra there just in case you have an issue, so you can retie it or whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good idea. Okay, awesome. Well, so tell us a little bit about your course. So she mentioned it earlier that she has a course where she goes over some of these types of things, right? And tell us a little bit more about what that's about.
Well, my course, the one that I have out right now, just focuses on the sewing machine.
Okay.
And I have had so many people when I've tried to help them to sew and I show them how to do something, and then I step back and say, you try, and they go, oh no, I don't want to touch it. You know, and I even have one friend who says she sweats when she tries to use a sewing machine because it stresses her out so badly. So I wanted a course for everyone who got a sewing machine for graduation or from their grandma or mom that they inherited, thought, oh, I'll learn to sew, and stuck it in the closet so that they can pull it out. I want them to understand the machine, understand how it works, why it works that way, so that they're completely comfortable with the machine and don't have to think about all that when they sit down to create, you know, whatever it is that's in their creative mind. So, I mean, we go over some detailed parts of the machine, but just because I think it's worth it to understand, you know, why we only turn the hand wheel one way, you know, why this moves when you do that kind of thing. So it's called Conquer Your Sewing Machine. And by the end, you should feel like you've conquered it and you're confident with any machine. That's the other secret, is that no matter if you buy a machine for, you know, $150, or if you buy a machine for, you know, $6,000, the sewing parts of it work exactly the same. They're going to thread the same, you know, bobbins wind the same, that type of thing. So yeah, that's what we talk about in there.
Okay, awesome. Well, so tell us where people can connect with you on social media.
Okay, I'm on Facebook. It's called The Sewing Circle. But Let's Get Sewing is the name of my business. And so if you put @Let's Get Sewing into Facebook, you'll still find me under The Sewing Circle. And then on Instagram, I'm Let's_Get Sewing.
Okay, awesome. But thank you
And I
so
have to give Jessica a shout out today because I did wear a Jessica Cramer original.
I should have mentioned
Today.
that. Yeah. So we're both wearing the Cecilia blouse pattern today. No, I'm sorry.
This is the raglan top. Yeah,
the raglan one. I take it back. We're both wearing a pattern, just not the same one. So that's another pattern that I have, is what she's wearing. So Jenny is one of my pattern testers, and she does a great job putting things together. And it's been a lot of fun getting to know her through this whole thing. We met in a business group online here, so we've never actually met in person, but it's fun to chat about sewing and learn different perspectives on how to do things. I learned quite a bit today, so this has been awesome. So thank you so much. So we will hopefully do another one of these down the road. If you have any suggestions on things you'd like to learn, let us know. We would love to put something together for you and see how we can serve you best. And leave us a comment. Love to know your reactions, and where you're from would be great. It's always good to know where people are hanging out. So, all right. Well, thank you so much. We will talk to you again soon, Jenny.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.